I'm absolutely astonished that you're not sitting in a jail cell for writing a book that went against the regime during the COVID era, because they cracked down pretty hard on those truckers. I mean, I remember watching from Australia, they were cancelling people's bank accounts, which seems to me a very Chinese-style way of handling a protest.
It was, and I should say that protests of this nature are not in the Canadian DNA like they are with our friends to the United States that are born of a revolution, that love the fight. So this was actually a big deal when, I'll say the right in Canada, but it wasn't just conservatives, but when the right in Canada stood up and said, we've had enough with this, this was a very big deal. And the government was threatened by that. The government was threatened by all of these people talking about freedom, by all of these people that didn't want to wear their masks, by all of these people that said we're through with following this unscientific vaccine mandate. And the government really had this tool in the arsenal that is supposed to be used in wartime that they used to crack down on the truckers.
Well, as you wrote on your Substack, mainstream media coverage overwhelmingly took the Trudeaupian view, publishing story after story that misrepresented the convoy, its goals and its supporters. As you said, this almost sounds like you're living through an example of wartime journalism.
Yeah, it became propaganda. I mean, at first when this was happening and you had thousands of trucks that were driving across the country, and you're from Australia, you know it's a big country, and you know that this is just building up momentum. And what's happening here is all of these trucks were going to the nation's capital. And at first the media just didn't want to cover it at all. And then when it got too big to ignore, they said, well, yeah, but it's going to be violent, and it's going to be hate. And then there was no violence. And then they said, well, yeah, but they're trying to be insurrectionists. And then someone said, well, no, they're not. And every time the narrative was disproven, they just ratcheted it up further and further until such a point went on that it was just this complete fantasy land that journalists were peddling. Like one story in particular, to give an example here, was that there was members of this protest that attempted to lock apartment residents in their apartment and burn it down. And this was actually two homeless people with mental illness that lit a fire in a hotel lobby that had nothing to do with the convoy. But by the time police came out and said this was not anything to do with the convoy, this has been reported on in the press. Politicians have been sharing this. It's been said on the floor of the House of Commons, and none of these people retracted it.
Yeah, well, it's a funny type of terrorist, which is what they were calling the trucker convoy, that sits there waving Canadian flags, singing the anthem and demanding freedom and a return to civil liberties. That's not your average terrorist in the modern world, I have to say.
No, it was our friend Mark Stein had called it the Bouncy Castle Rebellion, because they had bouncy castles and pig roast, and they had a hot tub, and they had saunas, all of these things that are not normally part of a terrorist attack. When the terrorists were flying towards 9/11, I don't think they said, well, hang on, let's roll out the inflatable hot tub in the business class section before we get there. That's not what you do when you're committing an act of terror. Yeah. They were there to reclaim the life that had been taken away from them in 2019. They were there to just live a life in which no one cared who was wearing a mask, no one cared who was vaccinated, no one cared about these divisions that they were told had to be the fault lines of society. That's what they were doing.